In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Oh yeah, and that means Tolkien! I am so ready for this. I've already had second breakfast. I got all my percentile dice ready to go. What? Percentile dice? I thought this system used D6s. Wait a second, did I buy custom dice for no reason? Aren't we just playing 5th edition D&D? I thought that's what we were doing here. Alright, if you want to go to Middle-earth, it's time for some Eldritch history. Today we're talking all about the Lord of the Rings. 2022 is shaping up to be a pretty good year for the franchise, with the One Ring RPG 2nd edition coming out earlier this year, and Amazon's The Rings of Power set to premiere in a matter of hours as a recording, which hopefully their multi-hundreds of millions of dollar investment turns out to be good. And the recent announcement that Lord of the Rings is coming back to 5th edition D&D early next year. But we'll get to that and the One Ring 2nd edition in a bit. But it seemed like a great time to talk about Lord of the Ring RPGs through the ages. But to do that, we got to go back to the beginning, as always. Of course, you can't talk about Lord of the Rings without talking about the man who started it all, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, better known as J.R.R. Tolkien, who of course wrote The Hobbit, or They're Back Again, which was published in 1937, and then the Lord of the Rings trilogy, quote unquote. He was known to say that it was actually just all one book, but it was released as 3 actual books with 2 books in them. So 6 books? 3 books? 1 book? Doesn't matter. Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and The Two Towers, which came out in 1954, and The Return of the King, which came out in 1955. And there are plenty of podcasts and all kinds of things that can talk more about the works and stuff. And if you haven't read them, I highly recommend them. There's a reason. These are cornerstones in fantasy. But for our purposes here, we actually have to skip ahead a little bit to get into legal issues. I'm trying to do this one chronologically, and these come up later, so bear with me for a second. So in 1969, Tolkien sold off the film, stage, and merchandising rights to The Lord of the Rings to United Artists, reportedly for £104,602. Then 1976, so 7 years later, United Artists sold them off to Saul Zaentz for $3 million, which good return on their investment there. Zaentz would then start Tolkien Enterprises, which later became Middle-earth Enterprises, which has held on to those rights ever since, and is essentially responsible for all the non-book Lord of the Rings related everything that we've experienced. So in 1977, so a year later, he helps get the Rankin Bass Hobbit animated movie out. The year after that, 1978, the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, and also for the more unsavory aspects of legal disputes. So this is where we get into the first directly RPG-related issues, that the original Dungeons & Dragons, you had things straight from Tolkien. You could play as a hobbit, you could fight an ent, a balrog, or wargs, which were just direct rip-offs of the books. They didn't have any rights to do anything like this. But it wasn't specifically D&D stuff that got them in trouble. It was actually over a board game that TSR was publishing a new edition of. I'll let Gary Gygax himself explain. Quote, TSR was served with papers threatening damages to the tune of $500,000 by the Saul Zaentz division of Elan Merchandising on behalf of the Tolkien estate. The main objection was the board game we were publishing, The Battle of Five Armies. The author of that game had given us a letter from his attorney claiming the work was grandfathered because it was published after the copyrights for JRT's work had lapsed and before any renewals were made. The action also demanded we remove Balrog, Dragon, Dwarf, Elf, Ent, Goblin, Hobbit, Orc, and Warg from the D&D game. Although only Balrog and Warg were unique names, and we agreed to Hobbit as well, kept the rest, of course. The board game was dumped, and thus the suit was settled out of court at that. I think it's funny that technically it's because of a board game that D&D has halflings and Baelor demons and wargs, not wargs, and treants instead of ents. I'm sure at some point, once D&D got as popular as it was, they would have been like, hey, you can't do this. But at this point, probably just wasn't big enough to be on their radar until this board game brought it to their attention. Be like, what's this company doing over here? Let's put a stop to this. especially with the movies either about to come out or having just come out. Xantz and Tolkien Enterprises wouldn't want anything on the market that they didn't have their fingers in. What's a bit ironic about all this is that Gygax wasn't even that big a fan of Tolkien's work. He, of course, had read them, and he recommended them in the Appendix N from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And the influence on the game is undeniable. I mean, obviously, he had specific creatures from them in the game. But for him personally, he was far more into more pulp stories, like Robert E. Howard or Fritz Leiber, the more sword and sorcery type of stories. So I'm curious if part of this, maybe he was a bit relieved of not having to add in these elements. I wouldn't say that he was pandering to the fans, but it was definitely I know people want to play these type of things, so we'll add this stuff into it. Well, a lesson he had certainly learned before with the rules for Chainmail, his miniatures war game that he made before D&D, in which their fantasy supplement had much the same stuff of, here's basically how you can do the Battle of the Five Armies or whatever. That's what people were wanting that fantasy supplement for. So he knew the desire for gaming in Middle-earth was there, but I don't think it was for him. But what's extra funny to me is that a few years later, in 1982, Xantz licenses the rights for an RPG to Iron Crown Enterprises, which is interesting on a couple fronts. One, they say that nobody had asked to do so before. That's why Iron Crown got the license, which is like, why didn't TSR just asked for the license after this? Like, hey, can we do this? Like, maybe they just got off on the wrong foot and they're like, no, we're good. But yeah, the story goes that nobody had asked before, so Iron Crown got it. And the second thing is, they somehow claimed that the RPG was a film product, not directly based on the novels, which is like, publishing rights are the one thing that Xantz doesn't have. So it's like, wait, you're putting out books? But no, it's not based off the books, it's based off the movies. Just like, I don't know how that worked, but apparently it did multiple times. So there you go. But anyway, with the license for Lord of the Rings, Iron Crown Enterprises, or ICE, puts out Middle-earth Role-Playing, shortened to M.E.R.P, from 1984 to 1999. And they based the system off their Rollmaster system, which was basically their house system that was based off percentile dice D100s. It was modified a bit for M.E.R.P. So in the Middle-earth role-playing, you get levels and classes for your character. Classes include Animist, Bard, Mage, Ranger, Scout, and Warrior. And then characters all have attributes, which were Strength, Agility, Constitution, Intelligence, Intuition, and Presence. So almost D&D, but a little bit different. And then also had skills. And these attributes and skills would range from 1 to 100. Again, percentile-based system. But skills can be modified above or below, so over 100 or below 1. And then combat worked by, you'd roll a D100 percentile. To that, you'd add the attacker's skill and the related attribute rating. And then you'd subtract the defender's dodge rating. And then that result would be compared to the defender's armor type and looked up on a table to determine the success or failure, which can also result in looking up a separate critical hit chart as well. And then spellcasting in the system. If you were a spellcaster, you'd choose a list of spells. There'd be 10 spells per list, and they'd all be themed, so like healing lists. And then as you level up, you get access to more of the spells on the list. And the game was actually set 1,400 years before the War of the Ring, in the years after the Great Plague, in the Third Age during the year 1640. Which again, if we're based off the movies, how is this thing that has not been depicted in the movies at all? Like... So that first edition came out in 1984. A couple years later, they followed up with a second edition. And M.E.R.P had dozens of expansions and products released. Lasted 15 years or so. So no real big surprise there that there's a bunch of stuff for that game. Too much for me to go over through here, but all kinds of stuff, including adventures, layouts of locations and maps, statistics for beasts, monsters, NPCs, extra notes for the GM for how to run things, and rewards to give your players, all kinds of stuff. Basically all you want from a RPG to give you extra stuff, they had it. And over the years it got published all over the place. The UK edition was published by Games Workshop. There's versions in Germany, Sweden, Japan, Finland, France. And in 1990, as far as I can tell, they in turn licensed the system out for the Middle-earth Play-by-Mail game, or Middle-earth PBM, which was a turn-based strategy play-by-email and play-by-mail game, which used some of the mechanics and info from M.E.R.P, which is an interesting side thing. Play-by-mail, I think, or play-by-post would be an interesting topic for the podcast, too, because it's like what you had to do before we had the internet to just play over streaming. 1993 saw a new collector's edition come out, still the second edition, but a new fancy book. And they were working on a third edition, but it was never published, which I'll get to why in a little bit, but there's a few more things I want to point out. One, some people say that M.E.R.P was the second best-selling fantasy RPG after D&D at its heyday. I've seen this in multiple places. I have not been able to see any validation for this, but it shows up a bunch. And I don't know if somebody just put it somewhere and it's been repeated or if it's legit true. It'd be fascinating if that was the case. I don't know. But again, just the story that I kept reading. It was like, where are we getting this info? It just kind of shows up. Nobody says where they know it from. Just, this is what it was. It's like, I'm going to need some proof on this. Then Iron Crown Enterprises, ICE, got in a little bit of trouble because they started pushing the envelope a little bit too far. They put out Tolkien quests, which would then become Middle-earth quests in 1985, 1986. And these were game books, reported to be some of the most complex game books. They have whole hex maps in there for you to explore around. There's 30 pages of rules in each book, which is it's a bit much for a game book. But that included basic rules with pre-generated characters. They had simple rules for fighting, moving, and gathering items. Then there was advanced rules, where you'd have to keep track of time, and there was a bunch of optional rules, including character creation, gaining experience, and a combat result that used a formula instead of tables. And then they also had rules for using these game books as solo adventures for M.E.R.P. But they ran into trouble because they're publishing books. Just storybooks, basically. I mean, you get to choose what you do. It's a game book, but it's still a book. So Allen and Unwin, which was an imprint of HarperCollins who had the publishing rights to Lord of the Rings, they sue ICE for publishing books. They're like, hey, we have the right to do this. You can't do this. So ICE recalls and destroys all copies of these books. At this point, there was 3 books published. The 4th one was just about to be released. They had to recall them all. The 4th book, Murder at Minas Tirith, it never makes it to market. So ICE lose about $2 million off of this, having to destroy all these things. They then later were able to resolve some of the issues or gain rights to do so. Then they published 4 more books. But at that point, I heard that the game book industry had kind of gone on a downward trajectory, which is interesting because it was only a couple of years later that they were able to get the rights. So I don't know if there was just a real sweet spot mid-'80s or what, but it seemed interesting to read that. It's like, wait, but 86, 87 is when the other ones came out. So I don't know how they missed a window. That was the window. I don't know. So they take that hit. It's not great for them, but they're able to hold on for a while longer. And from 1991 to 1993, ICE also puts out a different Lord of the Rings RPG called the Lord of the Rings Adventure Game. This one is set during the year 3018 of the Third Age, so just before the War of the Ring. And you can even meet and interact with the main characters of the books, but you don't get to take direct roles in that story, of course, unless your DM wants you to. The Lord of the Rings Adventure Game only ever got 3 releases, the original box set and then 2 adventures. There was 2 more sequel books promised, but they never reached production. And this one uses 2d6 for skill checks and combat, which is actually an expansion of the rules from the Middle-earth quest books. And it was designed as a stepping stone to get people to play M.E.R.P. The characters have attributes and skills that ostensibly range from -5 to +5, but again, skills can go over or under that. To attack in this one, you roll 2d6, add the attacker skill, plus the weapon's rating, subtract the defender's defense and armor rating, and then again, look up the results on the table. And in this one, the spellcasters had a much more limited number of spells to learn. And I've seen it said that this feels more in line with Tolkien's work, which just reminds me of studying The Hobbit in college, where my professor was convinced that, well, at least he liked to put forward the theory that Gandalf wasn't actually a wizard. He'd point out to the throwing the pine cones down on the wargs when they were on fire. It's like, well, I can light a pine cone on fire. That's all he's doing. It's not magic. which of course isn't true in light of the Lord of the Rings, but it is fun to think about. I've seen other things, say from a RPG perspective, Gandalf was just a fighter that was pretending to be a wizard, which again, fun to think about, but totally not true. He's like an angel thing, depending on what works you're going into. There's another interesting story during this time. Ben Riggs, who just released the book Slaying the Dragon, A Secret History of Dungeons & Dragons, which looks really good, and I want to check out, but I haven't yet. But he's posted about a story that is said to have happened in 1992, in which TSR almost acquired the rights to J.R.R. Tolkien's work. At the time, TSR staffer John Rateliff, who would go on to write the history of The Hobbit, and he worked on D&D and a future Lord of the Rings RPG, he was sent to London to negotiate the deal, which he missed Gen Con, which apparently at that time no TSR employee was allowed to miss Gen Con, but he was allowed to leave for this. And he even made the trip like a honeymoon where he also attended Tolkien conferences and stuff like that while his wife explored London because she didn't want to be stuck in a room with people talking about Tolkien. She said that she could do that in a day with him at home. But Rateliff met with Christopher Tolkien at the HarperCollins offices, where he asked for the rights to make RPGs, merch, and new books set in Middle-earth. And Chris Tolkien said yes to the RPGs and some merch, but no to the fiction line. So Rateliff goes back to Lake Geneva, and he tells this to the TSR CEO, Lorraine Williams. And according to Rateliff, her mortal words were not worth our while, so she passed on the whole deal. Which, at the time, the fiction properties of Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance were real good moneymakers for TSR, so it makes sense. But man, I can't imagine the alternate universe in which TSR was able to make official Lord of the Rings D&D supplements. How bonkers it would have been to have new Lord of the Rings books from whoever they got to do it. It's wild to think about. It is wild how different that could have been. It's probably for the best that it didn't happen, but man, it would be interesting to see. Especially if Rateliff was in charge, because, again, he's now a pretty well-regarded Tolkien historian, got experience in RPGs, and I think this quote about him made me think that maybe if he was in charge of the D&D Tolkien stuff, it would have worked out well. And he said that the thing that appeals to me most about Tolkien is I'd never met anyone who thought about trees the way I did. I think of trees as individuals, not interchangeable. Tolkien really liked and appreciated trees, and he conveyed that. Which is very wholesome. And I feel like if given the chance, I mean, he worked on the next RPG, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, it would have been interesting in his hands how that all would have worked out. But something that did materialize starting in 1992 was Other Hands, the International Journal of Middle-earth Gaming magazine, which was created by Professor Chris Seaman and went from 1992 to 2001. Although this was dedicated to gaming in Middle-earth, it also had essays and scholars of Tolkien in it as well. And Chris became an editor for ICE and contributed to the Lord of the Rings RPG by Decipher, the next one coming out. And the name of the magazine was actually taken from a letter Tolkien wrote to Milton Waldman around 1951, in which he said, "I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama." Which I feel like is a solid name for a fanzine, basically, is what it was. Unfortunately, Other Hands was sent a desist letter by Tolkien Enterprises, so that's what shut that down. Shifting back over to ICE, by the mid to late 90s, it's running into more issues. There's some poor decisions with a Middle-earth trading card game they tried to do. They print quantities that just don't make sense for a new game. There was also rising costs of paper, and a bunch of distributors are failing at this time. That's a bunch of different factors working together that kind of screw them over. So they decided to put M.E.R.P on hold, and they're just trying to hold out until Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, which have been announced at this point, until they can come out. But during this time, Tolkien Enterprises calls in the debts for the licensing, which also there's this side story of when asked about M.E.R.P in 1995, the licensing director of Tolkien Enterprises, Laurie Battle, said, "To be honest, our eyes focus more on royalty income rather than on the finer details of the games themselves." So even a few years before, ICE is really in trouble. They clearly just want to get the most money out of it as opposed to worrying about the games, which of course makes sense from a business decision, but sucks from a gamer perspective. So all this stuff goes down. 1999, ICE has to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And because of that, Tolkien Enterprises is able to recover the license, which you think might be the end of that. But Tolkien Enterprises continues to follow the bankruptcy proceedings. They stop ICE from selling past M.E.R.P products that could have helped pay off what they owed. Tolkien Enterprises even convinces ICE's bank to freeze their funds, which seems a bit extra to me. But this all leads to ICE in 2000 having to file Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which effectively kills off the company. But ICE's own intellectual property is bought up and it lives again eventually. But an interesting side note, one of the side effects of ICE going under is that Monty Cook was one of the ICE staffers at the time, and he gets caught up in this. So he actually goes on to work for TSR on Marvel Superheroes, although apparently what he worked on got scrapped because the line got scrapped. But Monty Cook would also work on Planescape and A Paladin in Hell. He transitioned over to Wizards of the Coast when they bought TSR, and he became one of the lead designers on 3rd edition. The Dungeon Masters guy specifically he was the writer on that one. And then he'd make a couple of his own companies, including Monty Cook Games in 2012, which is known for Numenera, The Strange, The Cipher System, Invisible Sun, and No Thank You Evil. Monty Cook definitely deserves his own episode of this podcast. It's just an interesting side effect of all this happening. So then in 2002, after ICE loses the license, as the movies are coming out, we get the Lord of the Rings RPG by Decipher Inc. And this one is set in the years between The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring, but can be run from the first age to the fourth age, and they have examples and ideas for doing so. And again, this drew from the movies, and it used screenshots as art in some cases. But again, they're limited only to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, so even the Silmarillion is off limits. They kind of work around that by having access to the appendices at the end of the Lord of the Rings, so they get a lot of the history. But this game runs off the Coda system, which Decipher used for several RPGs, and it's a 2d6 based system. So you have your primary attributes, which range from 2 to 12, which makes sense with a 2d6, which are bearing, nimbleness, perception, strength, vitality, and wits. You also have reactions, which are stamina, swiftness, willpower, and wisdom, which are kind of like saving throws. Playable races are dwarves, elves, men, and hobbits. And your orders, which are essentially classes, include barbarian, craftsman, lore master, magician, mariner, minstrel, noble, rogue, and warrior. And then you have elite orders, which are kind of like prestige classes in D&D, so ones you could level into later if you meet the requirements. These include archer, captain, knight, ranger, spy, and wizard. And this was pretty well received at the time. It won the Origin Awards for Best RPG in 2002. Only running from 2002 to 2006, the Lord of the Rings RPG had a much more limited scope of releases. It had the original core book, a source book for the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers. The Return of the King never was produced, as well as Fell Beasts and Wondrous Magic and a box set for Helm's Deep. Those last two were both worked on by Professor Chris Seaman from the Other Hands magazine. They also had a couple, like a narrator screen and a hero's journal, which was basically a character sheet, and then maps. They also released maps. Decipher's got a bit of an interesting history. It was actually founded in 1983, and their first project was the How to Host a Murder line of party games. But they soon branched into the collectible card game market, and they would get Star Trek games and Star Wars games, and even Austin Powers. Then after everything with ICE, they were able to, in 2001, get the license for Lord of the Rings card game at first, and then the next year, they decided, hey, we'll do RPGs as well. At that point, they lost the Star Wars license, but they put out a Star Trek and a Lord of the Rings RPG, both using that Coda system. But then by 2007, their license expired, so they canceled their Lord of the Rings products completely, which was in part due to the changing market for the time for card games and RPGs, but also it was revealed later that the brother-in-law of the founder eventually pled guilty for embezzling over $1.5 million from the company for like a decade. So there seems to be some bad luck for the companies that have Lord of the Rings licensing. Always some kind of legal stuff going on. some tangentially related stuff also starts to happen in the 2000s. In 2005, it's the beginning of M.E.R.P Con, which is founded by Hawk Robinson and others. In 2009, it changes its name to Tolkien Moot, which it still goes by today. And this takes place in Spokane, Washington, usually the third weekend of July. And it focuses on gaming in Middle-earth, and it has guest speakers, including John Rateliff. And each year it has a theme, such as elves, hobbits, Dunedain, or trees. It's also free and open to the public, so it's pretty cool. And Hawk Robinson also, starting in 2007, started Other Minds magazine, based off the same quote as Other Hands. And the purpose of this publication is to provide Tolkien-related content of interest to Tolkien enthusiasts of all kinds, and more specifically, information usable by those who love to use role-playing games to enjoy the many facets of J.R.R. Tolkien's imaginary universe, containing Middle-earth, Numenor, Endor, Arda, and all of Ea, using whatever game systems they desire. So these releases have essays, maps, art, music, modules for both adventures or full campaigns, source materials, conversations, reviews, letters to the editor, event announcements, product announcements, gamers wanting requests or GMs wanted requests. And they're specifically looking for stuff for Cubicle 7's The One Ring and Adventures in Middle-earth. We'll get to them in just a minute. Decipher's The Lord of the Rings RPG, Iron Crown Enterprises Middle-earth role-playing game, as well as some more fan-made type material, such as a D20 or D&D adaptation of Middle-earth, one of which is called Ea, which is based on the D20 system, so 3rd edition D&D. But there's also a different version of it that's just called the Basic Rules. That is a 1d6 system. There's a standard version that is percentile dice and an advanced system that's also percentile dice, but there's more charts and details. Other Minds magazine also supports M.E.R.P and Hitherlands, which are both fan projects. The Hitherlands seems to be gone now. I can't really find its presence on the web, but M.E.R.P still has a website that you can check out. It started in 2009. The last update I see is from 2012, but it's design focused on realism in creating characters, playability for at the table, and then flexibility in what you choose to want to be. But it also notes that you can get the 300 plus page core rulebook for free, but you need a password that you get from emailing them about it. So I don't know if that still works or not, but they require this password system because they lift a bunch of their rules from other Middle-earth role-playing games. So it's an interesting idea. The latest issue of Other Minds magazine is issue 25, which was put out in December 2021. So seems like they're still making stuff, just, fan content, so slow going. And then back to more official releases. In 2011, we start getting The One Ring, Adventures Over the Edge of the Wild by Cubicle 7. This game is designed by Francesco Nepitello and Marco Maggi. And one of the big things about this game is that it's split into 2 phases, the adventuring phase and the fellowship phase. So during the adventuring phase is when the hero set off into the wilds in search of adventure. This is where your standard RPG, have your adventure, fight, all that stuff takes place. But there's also the fellowship phase, which is where you rest and recuperate, you practice your skills, or pursue noble undertakings. And this is how designer Francesco Nepitello explains how the fellowship phase came about. He said, quote, "One of my primary design focuses was to make the passage of time a central feature of playing The One Ring. I feel that it is the unfolding of history that really turns the deeds of a character into an epic worthy of song. So making the passing of the years a mechanic of the game was a must. I've played a lot of King Arthur Pendragon in my time, an excellent game that successfully tackles the issue, and I've seen other games inspired by the same principles, Mouse Guard among the foremost of these. So the division in 2 distinct gaming phases was a natural choice." So with the adventuring phase, the players more often than not are reacting to the lore master's plots and their story. But during this fellowship phase is where players really get to take over some agency. They get to decide where they're going to go retire and rest at. Either they could go back home or to a sanctuary of theirs, some special location they've established. And then every player gets to decide on an undertaking. So they could try to meet a patron or heal themselves of corruption. It really reflects the fellowship resting and meeting in Rivendell, for example, from the books, of this downtime where they're able to take a step back from the adventures. The One Ring also uses specialty dice, because one of the designers at least really likes specialty dice. One of which is the Feat die, which is a D12, which only has the numbers 1 through 10, and the other two sides depict Gandalf's rune and the Eye of Sauron. And if you roll Gandalf's symbol, it's an auto success. It's a critical. But if you get the Eye of Sauron, it equals a 0 on your roll and something bad happens. And if this happens while you're traveling, it means you encounter some kind of hazard. Then there's also the success dice, which are D6, and on the 6 they also have a Tengwar rune. And getting these make successes even better. While the 1 through 3 in the dice are depicted differently, they're outlines instead of solid colors, which you ignore these results if you're weary on your travels, if you've been going too long without a rest. Now, the system works as you roll your Feat die plus a number of success dice equal to your skill that you're using. And you compare that to a target number, which is normally 14. Which again, you get the Gandalf symbol, auto success, Eye of Sauron, 0. So that's going to make it much harder to get that. And if you succeed, all the 6s you roll on the success dice are going to make that even better. And the first release for the One Ring was a core book, quote unquote, but really it was 2 booklets in a cardboard case. And it supported play in the Rovanian region known as the Wild. And they initially planned on having follow-up core sets for different regions, but instead, in 2014, they released a revised core set in a single hardcover with new edits, layouts, and errata and clarifications. They also put out a clarifications and amendments document for anybody who owned the previous version. And it was at this point that it just became known as the One Ring role-playing game. They lost that Adventures Over the Edge of the Wild subtitle. Releases for the One Ring included the Lore Master screen with a Lake Town supplement. And then most of the releases was like a dual release of a setting guide and an adventure book. So they had ones for the Wilderland, Rivendell, Rohan, Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, Bree, which was more of a mini setting. And they also put out Hobbit Tales from the Green Dragon Inn, which was a standalone storytelling card game, but it also had rules to use it with the RPG. And in 2016, Cubicle 7 released Adventures in Middle-earth. This basically used the Open Gaming license to convert the One Ring for 5th edition D&D. The setting is the gap between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The cultures, standing in place of races for 5e, included Bardings, Bjornings, Dunedain, Dwarves of the Lonely Mountain, Elves of Mirkwood, Hobbits of the Shire, Men of Bree, Men of the Lake, Men of Minas Tirith, Riders of Rohan, and Woodmen of Wilderland. The classes were the Scholar, who's described as a learned expert and master of the healing arts, the Slayer, a savage and doughty warrior, more associated with barbaric or martial cultures, treasure hunter or burglar to the less polite people, wanderer, an experienced traveler. The wanderer is most at home on the road or in the lonely wilderness. Warden, who's brave in spirit. The warden helps others rise up against the enemy. Warrior, a stalwart and disciplined fighter associated with rich and civilized cultures. They also had virtues instead of feats, which a lot of these were based off of your culture. So Bjornings, who were people who followed Bjorn, the werebear guy, they could learn how to track better or follow the paths of animals in their dreams, whereas the Dunedain could detect spirits, and the Bardings could be better with a bow. They also have backgrounds and skills, just like 5e, but there's some new skills, including Riddle, which doesn't mean you're just good with riddles, although it does mean that, but also you can convey or understand meaning in less direct words, kind of like a thieves' cant type of thing. There's also lore and shadow lore, what you know about generic stuff or more stuff related to the enemy. And then also traditions, which would allow you to understand how to approach people from different cultures and the like. There's also rules for journeys, corruption, which each character would have a shadow weakness or a flaw, basically, where the shadow seeks to exploit that and corrupt them. There's rules for gaining audiences, which were encounters with great lords or chance meetings. And it also had that fellowship phase. For this, they released the Player's Guide, Lore Master's Guide, and a bunch of adventures. And then there was also region guides for Rovanian, Rivendell, Breeland, the Lonely Mountain, Rohan, which was only released in PDF. And there was plans for a Moria box set, but that was canceled. Then in May of 2019, Cubicle 7 announced an upcoming The One Ring 2nd edition, set for release of Q4 of 2019 or Q1 of 2020, which would include a new core rulebook, a starter set, Lore Master screen, Fell Foes, which is a bestiary, a Minas Tirith guide, and adventures The Errantries of the King, which was set in Gondor, and Moria, the Long Dark. But then in November 2019, so just a few months before these were supposed to start coming out, they announced the cancellation of the line due to, quote, contractual differences arose recently, which we have been unable to resolve, and so we have decided to end our licensing agreement, end quote. So the second edition was scrapped. Both the One Ring and Adventures in Middle-earth are canceled. Their upcoming release Rohan Region Guide was only released as a PDF. After Cubicle 7 loses the license, Free League Publishing quickly picks it up. And in March of 2021, they kickstarted the One Ring second edition, which raised over $2 million. It's one of the best funded RPG projects on Kickstarter, or at least it was at the time. And their release for it says that now in its second edition, the One Ring comes with updated and revised rules, a new visual style, and a focus on the land of Eriador, the lone lands west of the Misty Mountains. Among its key features are rules for traveling across the land, journey, facing frightening foes, combat, and meeting the personalities of Middle-earth, council. Thorough advice for the lore master on how to bring Middle-earth to life, including rules for magical treasure, the shadow, and the Eye of Mordor. In-depth information on 6 patrons, individuals sponsoring the adventures of the player heroes, including Bilbo Baggins and Gandalf the Grey. A bestiary containing a spread of adversaries from lowly orc soldiers and highway robbers to monstrous cave trolls and barrow wights. Rules to create your very own nameless things, unknowable beings from the dark corners of the world. A complete landmark adventure, The Star of the Mist, with extra support for new lore masters in the form of tutorial advice throughout. And this edition just came out earlier this year after that Kickstarter, so there's not much available yet. They got the core rulebook, the starter set, a lore master screen with a compendium for Rivendell, as well as some dice. But they also have a digital... You can get a PDF for Strider mode, which is rules for solo play, which is pretty cool. I haven't been able to check this out yet, but I'm excited to. It seems really cool. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. When they point out that new visual style, it's real pretty to look at. When they first announced it, I was like, oh man, that looks so good. And they very recently announced that they're actually going to do the Lord of the Rings role-playing game scheduled for Q1 of 2023, which they describe this as, the Lord of the Rings role-playing contains everything you need to create exciting 5th edition adventures set in the world's most popular fantasy setting. 6 original heroic cultures from the lands of Eriador, 6 new classes, a host of terrifying adversaries, and comprehensive rules for journeys, councils, wondrous artifacts, and the subtle magic of Middle-earth. So this is basically updating the Adventures of Middle-earth. They got that core rulebook coming out, as well as Shire Adventures, a new set of adventures coming out as well early next year, which I'm very excited about. Adventures in Middle-earth is the one that I have. I was luckily enough, when they announced that they were getting rid of it, I was able to get the core rulebooks, and then they had a humble bundle for almost all the region guides and stuff. So I got those all digitally, thankfully, because prices are a bit wild on those now. And that about sums up the Lord of the Rings RPGs, at least the official ones. I'm sure in addition to the ones I mentioned, there's probably plenty of fan-released things over the years. I'm hoping the new Amazon show is good. They invested so much money in it. I hope they do a decent job. Not the least for the fact of seeing stuff in the Second Age, which would be fantastic. See a different aspect of the stories than we've seen on screen before. And hopefully be able to get some tie-in products with the RPGs for supporting that as well. It'd be cool if like the Star Wars RPG from Fantasy Flight, they had books where, oh, you can set it in this age. Here you go. That'd be fun. That'd be awesome. Because I think the fun of a Middle-earth based story is being able to set it in that world, and there's so many different aspects of that world depending on where you're at, that it's kind of a disservice to have a lot of them like, oh, you're during the War of the Ring or right around that time. It's like, yeah, but we already know what's happening then. Let's place it somewhere differently, like M.E.R.P did, where way before it's like, we don't really know what's going on here. So allow for that quote of Tolkien's of allow many hands and many minds to flesh out stuff that he just outlined. So hopefully the TV show does a good job of that, of being like, yeah, we know some of this stuff, but here's some more specifics. And of course, if you don't like it, then, this was somebody's interpretation. This is not canon, quote unquote, but hey, have some fun with it. I hope, I hope they have fun with it and make an entertaining story, which even if it isn't completely faithful, as long as they don't go drastically against what Tolkien wrote. I don't know all the extra stuff. I've only read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, so I don't have all that extra info going around in my head, so I don't have to worry about all that personally. But for those of you that do, hopefully it meets your expectations and you get something cool out of it. If nothing else, it looks like it's going to be visually striking. So hopefully we at least get some cool visual representations of some different parts of his lore. And again, hey, we can put this into the multiple RPGs we got going on here. Why don't we do a tie-in product so we get some cool new places to play? But I think that's all from me. So thank you very much for listening to this episode of Eldritch History. My name is Jacob Tomlinson-Korst. And until next time, may you always make your saving throw. Especially after 6 months of carrying a ring around just to throw it into lava so you don't decide not to at the very last moment, wasting everybody's time.